Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. Tolkien loved to see the world and humans is very much a part of the same creation. And his metaphors in Lord of the Rings, he compares characters to trees, but he compares features of the landscape to humans. He'll talk about we were in the lap of the mountains. And Lewis's metaphors, he often says, it's like when you see workmen by the side of the railroad drinking tea out of their tin cups. And I've looked for the workmen drinking tea out of their tin cups. But he's very comfortable, his metaphor, making the reader think about our world. Whereas Tolkien never does that. He never breaks the fourth wall of his fiction.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This is Crystal Downing, and I am joined by the producer of our podcast, Aaron Hill, because both of us are going to be interviewing the great David C. Downing, who recently gave his inaugural lecture for his role here as co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center. Last month, we focused on issues of film, and this month, we're going to take the inspiration David gave us by talking about the relationship between C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. So, David, thank you for joining us here today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I know. I had to ask him to walk over from one part of the office to the other part of the office.
We don't have to add great to the front of his name like a title, do we?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
David the Great.
I was going to say the late, great David Downing, but I realized that that's not a good idea.
Well, these inaugural lectures are actually because we are co-chairs for the Marion E. Wade Chair of Christian Thought. And for you listeners out there, if you have a Christian thought, you need to run it by Crystal and me, because we are the chairs of Christian thought.
Okay, let's get to the subject of David's inaugural lecture. He called it, "When is a Dragon More Than a Dragon?" And he used the idea of dragons as a way to compare the creative visions of Lewis and Tolkien. Do you want to explain why a dragon is what inspired your title?
Well, I noted that both Lewis and Tolkien talked about dragons as an indicator that you've entered the world of the marvelous, the world of fairy or the perilous realm. Lewis said, when I was a boy, we'd go bicycling in Ireland, and I'd look around and I could almost see Fafnir coming out of a cranny between the rocks, and I felt like I was in the Wagnerian world.
That's a famous Wagnerian dragon, I take it?
Yeah.
Fafnir?
Fafnir is a dragon in the whole ring cycle, Wagner's ring cycle. And Tolkien said that whenever he saw something about a dragon in his essay on fairy stories, he said, I knew I was in the realm of fairy. But they both said, dragons are very fun to imagine, but I wouldn't want to meet one in the real world. So that was a point of comparison, but then there's also a point of convergence. When Lewis was trying to illustrate the alliterative meter in one of his scholarly essays, he's trying to emphasize all these initial consonants, which are repeated in alliterative poetry. And he says, we were talking of dragons, Tolkien and I, in a Berkshire bar. The big workman who sat silent and sucked his pipe all the evening from his empty mug, with gleaming eye glanced toward us. I've seen him myself, he said fiercely. And we're almost sure that poem is based on a real incident. And the reason that Lewis thought it was amusing is they could talk about dragons all they wanted in the world of imagination, but you really wouldn't want a dragon showing up in our primary world. So that was my starting point, was the primary world we live in and the secondary world of imagination. But then I split those two into the aesthetic imagination and the spiritual imagination, because they both loved dragons in imagination, but didn't believe in them and wouldn't want a dragon to show up in our world, like Godzilla. But they also both were fascinated by stories about angels, and Lewis creates Eldils in his space trilogy, who are very angelic. And Tolkien said in a letter that Gandalf was actually meant to be one of the Maiar. He was an angel sent to help those who were fighting Sauron. But what interests me is they believed in the aesthetic imagination of dragons, but the part of the beauty of angels is you actually believe they exist. This is part of the substance of things hoped for. So that was kind of my starting point for the lecture, was the difference between aesthetic imagination and spiritual imagination.
Well, before we get into sort of the meat of your analysis of Tolkien,
That was the
and
meat.
Lewis and Dragons. Oh, that was it?
Yeah,
that
was it. That was it.
Wow.
Thank you.
This was a short podcast.
Thanks for joining us this week, guys. Tell us a little bit about your work and maybe some of the books you've written. How did you get to this point where you're one of the co-directors of the Wade Center, and I know you've done some work on Lewis, but maybe our fans are not as familiar with some of the works you've written in the past, and so just kind of give us an introduction. How did you get here, and how did you get to study Lewis and Tolkien?
Okay. Well, that's something of a long journey.
You can give us the short podcast version.
I was raised in a little church in Colorado, and the people there were good-hearted, but they tended to be comfortable with fairly simple answers to theological questions. So I was really struggling with my faith when I went off to college, and that's when I first discovered Lewis. My first book was Perelandra, and it was so much more expansive view of Christian faith and a much more exalted view of who God is than I'd encountered in my childhood. So I went from not reading anything by Lewis in a year to having read almost everything by Lewis.
Oh, wow.
And my first article that was published was a paper I wrote my sophomore year, and I put so much into it and had so much enthusiasm. The professor sent it off to Christianity Today.
Oh, wow.
Now, ironically, later that fall, I was struggling with faith, and I went to University of Colorado, and a friend of mine said, I know you like Lewis. There's a new article out by Lewis, and maybe it might help you. And he literally gave me the issue, and it was my article.
Oh, wow.
And then I read it, and I said, this is good. I need to rethink this. So it started in college, my fascination with Lewis, and also the whole idea of blending intellect and imagination. I was used to liking science fiction by H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, and I was used to struggling with theology. But somebody like Lewis who could easily move back and forth between intellect and imagination.
Yeah.
And then I read Tolkien totally on my own and didn't even know that the two of them were friends until I was well into college. I thought Tolkien was kind of new age because all my hippie friends said Frodo lives and all that sort of thing. And so, they were best friends. They used to hang out and drink ale together and talk about their projects. They were best friends? So I started writing books first on the Ransom trilogy, and then I wrote one on Lewis's spiritual journey called Most Reluctant Convert, one on his interest in mysticism called Into the Region of Awe. And so ever since, Chris and I both came here to do research at the Wade and got to know the staff here. And so eventually they started saying, I think the Downings would be a real addition to the Wade's mission and ministry, especially since Crystal's such a well-known Sayers scholar. She just sent in a book manuscript this morning.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
I think there's a typo on page 379.
Subversive. Just to tantalize our listeners.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on.
And that's also going to be Crystal's biography is going to be called Subversive, the Crystal Downing story.
So you mentioned a couple of these books. You mentioned the title of one, Most Reluctant Convert. But what are some of the other ones that you mentioned? The one on the Ransom trilogy?
That's called Planets in Peril. For you budding authors out there, don't just make up a phrase you like. Because everybody always says, where does Lewis use the phrase planets in peril? I said, he didn't. I just made that up because it sounded real evocative.
But he did use the phrase most reluctant convert.
He did.
Gotcha.
And he did use Into the Region of Awe.
Okay.
So don't just make up a title because everybody will ask you where you got it.
Crystal,
Speaking of
where
title,
did you get subversive from?
Well, because Sayers is subversive.
Oh, okay. Right.
So
it's
a descriptor. But talk about the title of your other book on Lewis, Into the Wardrobe, when it's gotten translated into other languages.
Well, Into the Wardrobe is a study of the Narnia Chronicles that came out when the movies started coming out. And it was translated into Spanish and Portuguese and Italian and Polish. And I actually got the Polish translation I had at my office. And a colleague of mine at Elizabethtown in Pennsylvania speaks Polish. He said, why did you write a book called Exploring the Cabinet? And I said, no, it's Into the Wardrobe. That's not what it says in Polish. So talk about lost in translation.
Do you get contacts about the carpentry? Or?
Yeah, it does sound like that.
Well, I bet there are a lot of Americans, and I was probably this way as a child. I had never seen a wardrobe. When I heard the word wardrobe, I thought it meant a bunch of clothing.
Right.
Yeah.
So The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I thought, oh, they're playing dress up. But the first time I went to England in college and saw all these old houses didn't have closets, and they had to have this piece of furniture that is called a wardrobe.
Yeah.
Right.
So I bet the same is true in Poland. They didn't have that phenomenon.
May not be a thing.
Yeah.
They probably call
wardrobe.
it a clothes cabinet or something.
Yeah.
Probably don't have the word
Probably,
wardrobe.
yeah.
Probably. When I went away to college, I had read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and knew the story, but had never encountered a wardrobe until my freshman year. And our dorm, they listed the furniture you had, and one was listed wardrobe. And so as before I was moving in, I was like, wardrobe. I didn't I didn't really know what to
I
expect.
wonder where it
And I was
leads to.
I was like, oh, this is just a portable closet. That's all that is. So,
Yeah.
Another one of my book titles, Most Reluctant Convert, I was doing a radio interview on it, and the announcer said, now we're going to hear from David C. Downing about his new book, The Most Reluctant Convict. I was thinking, that would probably sell better, talk about Lewis's prison years.
So I also happen to know, because I know you fairly well, that you've actually written a novel that features Lewis and Tolkien a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's true. When I speak so often on Lewis and Tolkien, people say, wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall at an Inklings meeting? Wouldn't you love to have lunch with Lewis? So I knew so much about Lewis and Tolkien, I thought I could pull off a story in which some young Americans are over in England in the 1940s. They're looking for the Spear of Destiny, and they have to enlist the aid of Lewis and Tolkien and Charles Williams. And the main character attends an Inklings meeting. That was published in 2010 originally, but it's coming out again this spring from Paraclete Press.
Oh, awesome.
So I had a really good time.
What is that called?
It's called Looking for the King.
All right.
And it's by David C. Downing.
David C. Downing.
There's a David Downing who writes erotic spy thrillers. And I got knocked on Amazon because they didn't think it was exciting enough or erotic enough. I go, this came out from Ignatius Press. How erotic did you expect it to be,
So tell us a little bit about your inaugural lecture about Lewis and Tolkien. What did you conclude about dragons? When is a dragon more than a dragon?
Well, the first level of answer is when a dragon is a synecdoche, the part represents a whole.
Is that a place in New York?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When is a dragon a Schenectady? And so a dragon represents the fact you've entered the world of marvels, the perilous realm, the world of fairy, as Tolkien called it. So they both liked that world of dragons. They both, as I said, were glad they didn't actually exist. At the second level, Lewis tended to think much more symbolically than Tolkien. He often had the reader in mind when he wrote stories, and he wanted people to be thinking about Christian worldview, Christian faith. And so when he brought up dragons, they tended to have symbolic or allegorical overtones. Mm-hmm. Eustace becomes undragoned because he's having dragonish thoughts. Yeah. There's 2 dragons in Pilgrim's Regress that have to be slain before the pilgrim John can complete his spiritual journey. And even in his letters, he was talking about writing Narnia, and he said, so many children have these stale Sunday school associations with Christianity, and I thought maybe if I wrote a fantasy involving Christian motifs that I could steal past those watchful dragons. Mm-hmm. And so he even used dragon metaphorically in his letters for some undesirable state. Tolkien's dragons tend to be not just symbols of cunning and malice or something evil. They tend to be actual characters.
Yeah.
I said in my talk, they're kind of like Bond villains. They're very witty and they're very sly. After they torch somebody and steal their gold, I think they mix themselves a martini. They have sort of that. So Tolkien tended to do that.
Stirred.
Exactly.
Well, they did get Benedict Cumberbatch to voice him in
that's
in
true.
The Hobbits.
Yeah.
He's a British character. Yeah.
Well, in his stories, he had kind of a secret liking for dragons. They all have kind of a charming, cunning personality. Farmer Giles of Ham, Smaug. So he tended to do more with them as characters than Lewis did. And I think that has something to do with their view of what they were doing as Christian fantasy writers. Tolkien was much more into God as the creator of our world and our sensibilities. And one of the best ways to pay homage to God is to be creators and world builders, or he called them sub-creators. Mm-hmm. And so he spent a lot of time on all the details of his world's history and background. He has 600 named characters in Lord of the Rings, whereas Lewis tends to go fairly quickly. What am I trying to accomplish in the reader's minds? What am I hoping there will be? I wouldn't say their takeaway. That sounds too didactic.
Yeah.
But he said about the Ransom trilogy, after the first one came out, Out of the Silent Planet, he wrote to a Christian friend of his, out of 60 reviews, only 2 noticed any theological symbolism in the story. And he says, I think any amount of theology can be smuggled into readers' minds under the guise of romance without their knowing it. Now, Tolkien would never say that. Tolkien would never say, I want to use my creative writing as an evangelistic tool.
In fact, didn't he disparage Lewis's writing because he thought it was too allegorical?
He did, especially Narnia. He was very unsympathetic to Narnia. He thought it was, first of all, a mishmash. Everything that Tolkien did came out of Nordic and Northern European Germanic mythology, dragons, trolls, even rings of invisibility, rings of power. And he thought that Lewis was a little bit classical, a little bit Christian, a little bit rock and roll.
So Lewis was postmodern.
In a sense. There's a famous book called The Fox and the Hedgehog. It starts off with an epigraph that says, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one thing. Meaning the fox is very cunning and has all kinds of tricks, where the hedgehog just has a thick skin, and that's his protection. And this book is comparing Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. And he's saying Tolstoy was a fox. He was into politics. He was into theology. He was into social gospel.
Yeah.
I mean, social improvement. Whereas Dostoevsky was always turning the same themes over in his mind over and over again. And I would argue that Tolkien was a kind of hedgehog. He really wanted to apply his Catholic faith to a reimagining of Nordic mythology for England. And almost everything he did somehow contributed to that one great lifelong project. Whereas Lewis is equally interested in his scholarship, his apologetics, his adult fantasy literature, his children's literature. And he draws, as we said earlier, classical mythology, European mythology, the Bible, talking animals. So in general, his mind was much more agile, but you might say he had sort of a centripetal imagination. Things went off in all kinds of directions. No, that's centrifugal.
Yes.
I don't know which one is
Centripetal goes towards the center. Centrifugal goes
away from
towards the circumference.
Yeah, I would say for Tolkien, almost everything came back to his amalgam of his Christian faith, his Catholic faith, and his love of European mythology. Almost everything comes out of that core.
Well, you see that in who invents languages and then writes poetry in those languages.
Right.
You know, I mean, it takes a special kind of mind to do that, you know.
Right.
Whereas Lewis just kind of picks and chooses words in like the Ransom trilogy, you know, that are these sort of old solar tongue words, but he doesn't really try to, you know, put them together into anything.
Yeah, there's no appendix where you can look up all the glossary of the words. At the back of the Silmarillion, there's a glossary of about 100 words that you can actually see that and means silver, so the Anduin is the long silver river, but Anduril, the sword, is long and silver. So they all, just like looking up Greek and Latin roots.
Oh, wow.
None of the words in Lord of the Rings are just made up. They all, if you know the two Elvish languages, you can actually translate them into English.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, one of the things we have here at the Wade, right down in our museum, is a kiosk where you can watch Tolkien talking in his made-up language, talking in Elvish. So you can hear Tolkien's Elvish.
And they actually have conferences where linguists talk about these languages and the different forms of declensions, but it's all his imaginative language.
Wow.
They talk about it as if these are real spoken languages.
Yeah.
Which, I shouldn't say this in a public venue, but that's taking it a step too far.
Well, there are some people that have learned it and that speak it.
Yeah,
so,
okay, I guess so.
Well, one of the things I liked about your inaugural presentation, David, was clarifying the different kinds of fantasy there are. I think a lot of people haven't thought of genres of fantasy. They just kind of lump together all fantasies into one genre. Can you explain the different genres of fantasy that you've discovered?
Thank you. That's a good question. Farah Abraham is a scholar who did a taxonomy of fantasies, and she talks about a portal fantasy where you start out in our primary world and then you go off to the world of imagination, something like From the Earth to the Moon or Journey to the Center of the Earth. And then you have an immersive fantasy where you don't go anywhere. It just starts out in the world of imagination. And then you have...
And that's what Tolkien does, right?
Yes.
Immersive fantasy.
The very first line of Hobbit is, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." So the very first sentence, we have this imagined creature that doesn't exist in our world. And I think he liked immersive fantasy because he didn't want to start out in our world. He wanted to take you to the world of the perilous realm, the world of marvels.
Or not even take you, just start you there.
Right.
Just immerse you in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas Lewis liked portal fantasies because he's always got this sense of wanting to baptize the reader's imaginations. So let's start out in Oxford, but when you go through the wardrobes, suddenly you're in the world of fantasy.
Yeah.
And
it's sort of a what if.
It is, yeah.
Or going through the picture on the wall
Right.
where the water starts sloshing.
Now, I've always wondered why that is a portal. I understand why the wardrobe is a portal, because it was made of the tree that Eustace brought back from Narnia.
Yeah.
And but I never understand why that picture works as a portal. I think someone needs to write another Narnia
the
chronicle.
frame made from the tree?
Well, I
Right?
bet.
That's a good guess.
Don't you think that because Lewis and his brother took boats back and forth between England and Ireland so often, they had a sense of they were entering in a different realm, because England became associated with their education, whereas Ireland is associated with especially their mother, but also a fantasy realm.
Yeah, that's interesting, because he goes to a lot of length in Surprised by Joy to describe their first trip across on the Fleetwood boat to England, and how alien England seemed to an Irish boy. He said the English accent sounded like the voices of devils. That's a good theory. Yeah,
I'll have to
for
write
him,
it
that
up.
would be. It was literally a portal.
Yeah, I like that. That's
As a
'cause
matter of
he
fact-
does talk about moving between both of those worlds.
Yeah. And portal is just a little bit different from porthole. So I think we're getting somewhere. That's a good theory.
He grows up and then he moves away from home. You know, like kids, they grow up and they can't go back to Narnia. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Well, the other two kinds, I mentioned immersive, which Tolkien liked. I mentioned portal fantasy. There's one called the intrusion fantasy, where something from the imaginative world of danger and terror and wonder breaks into our world.
Like War of the Worlds,
Yeah.
where you
Like
get
War of
the
the Worlds,
aliens.
right? Or Godzilla, some creature
Or
comes out of...
Independence Day.
Or Independence
Yeah,
Day.
yeah.
And I don't know why it works out so schematically, but of our writers, the one person who tended to do intrusion fantasies was Charles Williams. We almost always start out in England, we're in London, and then some magical, demonic, occultic thing breaks into the ordinary world. The fourth one is dream fantasies, where it doesn't feel like our primary world or the secondary world. It feels like all the rules are ever changeable and fluid. And one of our 7 writers here at the Wade who tended to write dream fantasies was George MacDonald.
So like Lilith or something?
Lilith and Fantastes. But even the children's stories have more irrational elements.
Yeah.
In Narnia, there's a certain inner logic. Once you know you're in Narnia, things work a certain way.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Golden Key, I always go, did I read that or did I dream that after I fell asleep?
Yeah, same thing in Fantastes. He's just
Right.
sort of there, and then all of a sudden there's the river in the room.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Right.
That would be a good dissertation for somebody. Take the 4 kinds of fantasy writing and compare 4 of our authors to those 4 and explain why they preferred that kind of genre. That's a good dissertation right there, I think.
Yeah.
We don't have a
Okay,
whole...
Aaron.
Yeah.
Your dissertation. You can do that.
Sure thing. Sounds good. Yeah.
Don't we have a motif on this
We do.
podcast about
We do.
books that somebody ought to
It's
write?
the running gag. I always tell people if you want to figure out what to do for dissertation for literature, just listen to the podcast, because you guys are constantly generating all these great ideas and insights, and good stuff.
Another thing I talked about in my inaugural lecture was how their commitment to the immersive fantasy, we're going to start out in the subcreated world that Tolkien believes so strongly in, versus we're going to allow a fluidity between the primary world and the secondary world of imagination. Even in their metaphors, Tolkien loved to see the world and humans as very much a part of the same creation. And his metaphors in Lord of the Rings are very often, he compares characters to trees, but he compares features of the landscape to humans. He'll talk about we were in the lap of the mountains, or the fingers of the wind were reaching underneath their clothes. It was so cold.
Huh.
Or the mountain stuck up like a tooth. And Lewis's metaphors, he often says, it's like when you see workmen by the side of the railroad drinking tea out of their tin cups. And I've looked for the workmen drinking tea out of their tin cups. But he's very comfortable, his metaphor, making the reader think about our world. Whereas Tolkien never does that. He never breaks the fourth wall of his fiction and says it's kind of like something that happens to you back there on Earth.
It kind of makes you think that, like, you get the idea that Lewis is observing these things, and he sort of makes a mental note of it, and then puts it back in, in a story or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, he actually, another fascinating thing about Lewis is his critical essays give you insights into his own creative process. In one essay called Dante's Similes, he said, Dante was the first person to compare an emotion to an emotion. So he'll say, what he felt like is what you would feel like if this happened to you. And Lewis thought that was original with Dante. But when you're reading the Narnia Chronicles, they're in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, they're trying to get Drinian, the master, to turn back from this island, and he keeps going straight. And he says, it's like when you're in the back seat of a car and you keep telling the driver to turn and they're not listening to you. But once again, he's comparing the emotion of the characters in the story to your emotions as a reader. And Tolkien would never do that. He would never call your attention to the reader's primary world.
Yeah.
He would think that was kind of breaking your contract with the reader once you've immersed yourself.
When I read Tolkien, it reminds me of that passage in Romans 8 where it says, and all of creation is groaning in travail together. So Tolkien saw trees and landscape as much a part of this battle between good and evil. They're all groaning together.
Well, he was really ahead of a time in terms of his ecological sensitivity.
Yeah.
He wrote letters to the editor saying, why are they cutting down these trees? Why are why didn't have to pave this road? Why can't it be a...
Yeah.
And he had this extreme feeling, almost literally, of the earth groaning before developers and woodcutters.
Yeah. I was watching The Fellowship of the Ring the other day, and there's this scene where they're cutting down all the trees, by the tower. And I thought, wow, this is very relevant, especially with all the stuff that was happening in the Amazon and the burning and all that kind of stuff at the time.
Well, he was the only author I can think of who compares people to trees. When Gandalf is facing the Balrog, he said he looked like a withered old oak, trying to weather this terrible storm. And when Legolas jumps up and gets out his bow to shoot at someone, it says he looked like a young willow, on a still night.
Huh.
And how many people think to compare characters to trees? But it's very characteristic.
We're used to the reverse,
Tolkien.
Of course. The
Right.
tree looks like a goblin-y character.
Well, he did that too. Of course, he's got Old Man Willow. When he was little, the kids, they had a big hollowed-out willow tree, and it was so big they could climb inside. And I think that incident of his kids playing in this old willow made him think about
the Ents.
The willow tree, and the Ents, right?
Yeah.
When he was young, he read Macbeth, and it says, until the woods come to Dunsinane. And he thought that would be a great scene when all the woods go marching off to fight a battle. And then he found out it was only metaphorical. So he tucked it away in his back. I'm going to write a story in which the woods do march on evil humans and evil orcs.
So as you were preparing this lecture comparing Lewis and Tolkien, did you learn something new about Lewis that you had never noticed before, even though you've written, 5 books on C.S. Lewis? So did the act of comparison put Lewis in a new perspective?
Well, I would say by comparison, I thought that the Ransom trilogy was fairly well-developed world building. First we go to Mars, then we go to Venus, then we have a big adventure here on Earth. But Tolkien critiqued Out of the Silent Planet. At the end of Out of the Silent Planet, the narrator says, I showed this to Ransom, and he said, well, what about all the variety of continents, and what about all there were different kinds of rasa, they weren't all the same. And he's actually reflecting Tolkien's critique of Out of the Silent Planet. So I think it didn't occur to me until I really looked at Tolkien's commitment to world building to realize that Lewis will do just enough for plausibility, but then he wants to move on to some didactic lesson or some symbols that might baptize your imagination. I think he was much more reader-centered than Tolkien was. If Tolkien had never published Lord of the Rings, I think he still would have said it was worthwhile. He called it his mad hobby. Whereas Lewis almost always started out with, I want to finish this book. Here's my audience. Here's my purpose.
Yeah.
And his rate
here's
of getting...
my publisher.
And here's my publisher, yes. I mean, he tended to get things into print very quickly. Tolkien called Lewis that indefatigable man because he was coming up with a book a year on top of all his scholarship. And Lewis called Tolkien a dilatory genius. You know, he had this great thing, but he just, dilatory, unmethodical man is what he called Tolkien.
Wow.
In a way, it's amazing they were friends for so long because temperamentally,
they were so different.
Yeah, temperamentally, they had quite a few differences.
Yeah. So I was actually going to ask you, David. You mentioned the Ransom trilogy. So how does your thesis apply to? Because we typically, and you referenced a lot, the Chronicles of Narnia. There's a dragon and Eustace and the Undragoning, and then there's Smaug and the Hobbit. How does your theory apply to their other works? So Tolkien's Silmarillion, and then also the Ransom trilogy with Lewis. Because I agree with you. I feel like Lewis is trying to do some world building there. And there's a dragon in Perelandra, which we mentioned. So how does this apply? Your analysis apply to those other works?
I was hoping someone would ask me about the dragon. Thank you for asking.
Okay.
Because I said early on that Lewis always sees dragons as as symbols of evil, cunning, lust, malice, greed for gold. But we have a very likable domesticated dragon in Perelandra.
He likes to have his tummy rubbed.
He likes to have his tummy rubbed, exactly. I wonder if they have like dog bones or they have dragon bones and you throw them. But this is an unfallen planet, so even a dragon. The dragon comes from the image of the Garden of the Hesperides. There's a dragon guarding the tree of golden apples. So he's really guarding the innocence of that Eden. He's not really trying to guard his own gold.
Is the word dragon itself, Anglo-Saxon? Or what's
it goes
its
back
etymology?
to Latin, Draco.
Oh, okay.
And it means something.
Something profound.
Profound.
Okay. So you do think the dragon in Perelandra is symbolic?
Oh, I think he's there because he's mixing Eden with the Garden of the Hesperides.
Okay.
And there's a little bit of Turnanog in there, the Irish heaven in their mythology.
Gotcha.
This is the kind of synthesis or syncretism that Lewis loved to do in imagination, which annoyed Tolkien. Right.
Yeah.
Your larger question was good. My binary between someone who just wants to build a world for its own sake, to be a sub-creator, versus someone who wants to imbue the story with theological motifs.
Yeah.
That's not quite as clear if you leave the Ransom trilogy and the Lord of the Rings. I think you mentioned earlier that Silmarillion starts out on a very strong theological note.
Yeah.
With the music of the Ainur.
The Maiar or angels.
Right. And it's really a kind of creation story. Tolkien often accused Lewis of plagiarizing him. And I think the idea that you sing the world into existence is very strong in the Silmarillion, but then that's what Aslan does in Magician's Nephew.
Mm.
I'm glad they didn't live so long that there would be a lawsuit there eventually going. Although what's the thing in Job about the sons of God sang for joy? Mm-hmm. They might have both gotten the idea from that line in Job.
Huh.
But the Silmarillion is very theological. I wish they'd done a better job in the Tolkien biographical movie. Tolkien had just been on the firing line for 2 days straight with no sleep. He's exhausted. In the movie, they show him dreaming of Sauron and evil and flames. But actually, that's when he started writing the opening of the Silmarillion. And it's this beautiful, transcendent view of the All-Father who's having his archangels to sing creation into being. But then there's a Lucifer figure who starts singing dissonant notes. Yeah. But the All-Father is able to take those discords and to enfold them in even more complex harmonies. And it's almost allegorical or parabolic, which is unusual for Tolkien. He doesn't tend to be that theological.
It's almost like Tolkien is trying to baptize his own imagination insofar as he's just felt sullied by all this horrible death and destruction. So when he is removed from it, it's like he has to purify the dirt of the imagination with the beauty of creation.
Right. And on fairy stories, he defended the idea of escapism. He says the only people who worry about escape are jailers, not the escapee. It's like you're escaping, pre-OW camp. But I think for him, there's a real therapeutic power to imagination. And I think writing that scene when he's right in the middle of World War I trenches, that would be a very healing experience to go to this other place where you see the transcendent goodness of God being able to enfold evil and turn it into an ultimate good. The same thing happened to Lewis. When his mother died when he was 9 years old, he was very traumatized. And his father saved the page on their Shakespeare calendar that said, "Let it go hence, ripeness is all," which is a line from King Lear. Mm-hmm. Now we're reading Out of the Silent Planet, and when one of the Harassa is killed by the evil earthlings, they have a funeral service, and they start saying, "Let it go hence, let it be no body." And so somehow therapeutically, the beauty of this Malacandrian funeral dirge is somehow bringing some imaginative healing to this young boy who lost his mother at 9 years old, I would propose.
I never connected that. I had no idea those things were connected.
Well, I think they are.
Awesome. Yeah, it just feels like in the Silmarillion that, well, it's interesting because it's almost like a world within a world. He's created this totally sort of lives on its own world of Middle Earth, but then there's almost like this whole other realm, this sort of, not imaginary, but theological realm within Middle Earth itself that you don't necessarily get if you just read Lord of the Rings. So it's always fascinating to me to think about that. Him as a world builder, but he's also, it's like a theology as well.
And a history.
Yeah.
I mean, the first age, the second age, the
prehistory,
third age.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of he actually said in the letter, somebody said, "Why don't you explain all these historical allusions?" And he said, well, part of the realism is the sense of the evocative past and only having shadows of the past. And he said, if I explained all those, it wouldn't have the same effect. We all hear somebody talks about Waterloo and somebody talks about, all these evocative things. And it's almost more powerful when you don't quite know what they're talking about than if you go to Wikipedia every time. It is interesting to go back to Silmarillion. In The Lord of the Rings, when they go to the Barrow Wight, there's all these evil wraith creatures inhabiting the barrows. But he has a dream of being a dead king. And if you go back to the Silmarillion, they're on an old battlefield. And so there's a reason that he's having that dream in that part of the country near the Shire.
Oh, wow.
So it's Laura Schmidt, our archivist, says that the Silmarillion is kind of the Old Testament of Middle Earth, which helps you understand Lord of the Rings, which is the New Testament of Middle Earth. Mm-hmm. That's very true.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of my goals is to always get Dorothy Sayers into these podcast conversations.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. That's too bad.
So I just want to make clear this idea from Tolkien about subcreation and how that harmonizes with Sayers' view of creativity, that the Imago Dei, which is described in Genesis 1:27, that we are created in the image of God, Imago Dei, for her is fulfilled when we're creative, since Genesis 1 presents a God who is not a judge or a lawgiver or even a redeemer. Genesis 1 is about God as creator, and if we're created in God's image, we are most godlike when we create. And it seems that that is consonant with what Tolkien would think, that you just create a whole new world to be like God, our creator.
Mm-hmm. And obviously Tolkien would resonate very much with that view of the creative process.
Yes. And part of what Sayers said is that she had trouble, as did Tolkien, with the idea that you should write literature in order to convert people or evangelize them or propagandize them somehow. And she said that, quote, "The only Christian work is good work well done." And I also think Tolkien would agree with that, because it goes along with what you said earlier. Even if he never published it, even if he never earned a penny out of his work, he was committed to it as good work well done. It was a good in and of itself, just as God's creation was a good in and of itself.
And I think there's room for both of those in terms of Christian artist or Christian fantasy. Someone asked me at my inaugural, do you think Tolkien's view is better that you should just try to do good work and be a great world builder as an expression of the image of God in you? Or do you think Lewis's view is better, that we should use our imaginative gifts to try to reach people and baptize their imagination? And I answered with a passage from 1 Corinthians about the body, and the eye shouldn't say to the hand, I don't need you, or the hand shouldn't say to the eye, I don't need you. They all have a valuable function in the overall body. I think that's just as true of Christian imagination as it is with the Christian church.
Well, David, I'm grateful for all of your scholarship and your work and your insights. I learn something new every time I talk to you, and I'm sure that our listeners do as well. So thank you for sharing with us.
And Aaron, we are grateful for you.
Oh, well, thank you.
And your great work as producer of this podcast.
Thank you.
If we didn't have your technological savvy, we would not have these great conversations.
Well, thank you. Well, if you guys didn't get a chance to listen to our previous episodes, you can go listen to Crystal's inaugural lecture, which is on our podcast, and then also our recent episode with Pavel and him talking about Lewis and Tolkien and their impact in the Czech Republic. So got some good content out there for 2020. And then also we had that great movie discussion that you had, David, with Laura and with Crystal about the Tolkien movies. So if all of us talking about this Tolkien stuff has made you want to go rewatch The Lord of the Rings, you can do that. And listen to our discussion about that as well. So we had a good time.
Well, thanks for the invitation. Don't be a stranger.
Yes. Thank you, guys. The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave a review on iTunes and especially tell your friends. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, and our resources, visit our website at wheaton.edu/wade.